23 years ago, for the year 2000, the American Jewish Committee commissioned a survey on Jewish opinions. They do this every few years, and they ask questions about various topics, about American Jewish attitudes toward Israel, about their political persuasions, about their perspectives on anti-Semitism, and so on. In the year 2000, they asked a novel set of questions that, as far as I can tell, they never asked before, and they never asked again. These were questions about intermarriage, about Jewish people marrying people of other backgrounds. The results were fascinating, and I think the reason they never asked those questions again is because the answers they got were not what they wanted to hear, or at least not what rabbis and what I call professional Jews wanted to hear, people who work at federations and Hillels, and the people who are very invested in institutional Jewish life. Well, they asked these questions and they knew their answers, but it turns out that the leadership's answers were not the answers of the ordinary people. Is intermarriage inevitable in an open society? Well, the establishment would want to say no. 80% of American Jews said yes. It would pain me if my child married a Gentile. Well, the establishment would have said yes, but most Jews said no. 56% disagreed. Is encouraging conversion to Judaism the best response to intermarriage? 68% of American Jews said no. And then they asked the hardest question: should rabbis officiate at intermarriages? Now keep in mind that both the conservative and the reform movements, rabbinical associations, have policies on the books saying that rabbis should not officiate at intermarriages. The reform movement has sort of a don't ask, don't tell policy when it comes to that issue. About half of reform rabbis today, in 2023, will officiate at intermarriages. In 2020, it was maybe 30 or 40%. But the conservative rabbinate to this day will expel you from the rabbinical association if you are found to have officiated at an intermarriage. So the rabbis, should they officiate an intermarriage? The rabbis would say, no way. But 57% of American Jews said, yes, they should, even if a Gentile clergy person is involved. 57% said, yes, Jews should co-officiate. And another 16% said, well, they can officiate as long as there's no co-officiant, no other clergy person there. But if you add up those two numbers, at 57 and 16 is 73%, 3/4 of American Jews said rabbis should show up and officiate in some circumstance at a marriage of a Jewish person to anyone. Only 22% said rabbis should refuse to officiate, even though so many rabbis refuse to officiate. What you see in these questions and the answers is a huge gap between the leadership and the people. Jews have voted with their feet. There's a reason why the conservative movement, with this absolute ban on intermarriage, has plummeted in its market share of American Jews. Used to be 30-40% of American Jews identified as conservative. Now it's 15%. They've almost caught the Orthodox on the way down, because the Orthodox are only about 10%, and they also refuse any accommodation. The reform movement has grown in part because of some degree of acceptance, and they'll accept you as a member even if they wouldn't do your wedding. In some ways, humanistic Judaism is unusual in that respect. We've always accepted anybody as a member and been happy to celebrate any kind of loving partnership. Doesn't seem like rocket science to us, or a radical maneuver. But we've always felt that it's important to be where the people are. When you ask American Jews, what do they believe? Many of them don't believe in the God of the Bible. Many of them don't even believe in a higher power of any kind. If you ask them, what practices do you follow? Do you light candles on Friday nights? We actually did. Most American Jews don't. You ask them, do you refuse to handle money on the Shabbat? 90% still handle money on Sabbath. You ask them, do you keep kosher? 15% keep kosher, 20% maybe. But if you ask them, do you celebrate Hanukkah? 80% light some degree of Hanukkah candles. I don't know what percent out of 8 they get to, but at least some Hanukkah candles are lit. How many of you have attended a Passover Seder in the last year? 70% have participated to some extent in a Passover observance. Now, why is it that Hanukkah and Passover are so much more popular than lighting Shabbat candles or following the restrictions around kosher practice? Well, Hanukkah and Passover happen to occur at the time of year when the surrounding culture also has major holidays for Christmas and for Easter. So if you're in an interfaith family, which increasing numbers of Jews are, now you have your parallel. You have your Hanukkah and Christmas, your Easter and Passover. Even if you're doing both culturally, you have a parallel experience. I've had plenty of people who come to me for a wedding and they say, well, we were very regular about celebrating the high holidays, Hanukkah and Passover. And I have to explain to them, well, traditionally, the high holidays were Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Jewish New Year, the Day of Atonement. Oh, well, that's another major difference, you see. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur take place in the synagogue, with the congregation, with membership and tickets and money. Hanukkah is at home. Passover is at home. They're with family. They're around food. And yes, we have a wonderful Oneg Shabbat reception waiting, but it's not the same as the Hanukkah feast, as the Passover Seder. You see, for many people, their Jewishness is about the home. It's about the family. It's not about the institution. And there's a reason why decreasing numbers of Jews formally affiliate with any congregation at all. They voted with their feet. They have voted with their feet in many ways, joining a congregation, coming to services, sending their children to Sunday school. Sunday schools have crashed in population. They're down 30% across denominations in the last 15 years, even before COVID. In fact, many Jews aren't members of anything. To be a member of a congregation today is a minority experience. You, humanistic Jewish members, are an elite in the American Jewish community because you've joined something. One of our attempts in this congregation has always been to pick the right slogan. How do we explain who we are? And one time I came up with what I thought was a good one, but it's hard to do in print. It was, we're better than nothing. Because it works on two levels. On one sense, we're better than nothing, but also we're better than nothing. We're better than being nothing, than doing nothing, than having nothing, than losing out on the benefits of community. In many ways, we've tried to create a religion or a Judaism, a congregation of the people, by the people, for the people. That's the point for us, is the people. When Humanistic Judaism started 60 years ago, our core value was to tell the truth, to say what we believed, and to believe what we said. Do you remember the story of the emperor's new clothes? Where the tailor comes in and claims to have made this beautiful clothing that only the smartest people can see, and so everyone imagines, they don't want to admit that they're stupid, and so they claim to see this beautiful clothing when in fact the emperor is walking around in his underwear. There's truth and then there's what people are willing to admit. Many Jews, when our movement started 60 years ago, said they were religious. Synagogue affiliation rates were very high as Jews moved from urban areas where they actually weren't as affiliated to suburban areas where, to be Jewish, you joined the JCC and you found a synagogue that you joined. That was how you identified as Jewish. But these Jews going to synagogue weren't necessarily religious. It was the emperor's new clothes. The communal events in their congregation were focused on prayer services, Shabbat services, ritual and liturgy. But the people who came to the services, they were there for the food. They were there for the fellowship, for the community. Some of them came for the Kiddush after the service, not for the service itself. I even knew one person whose funeral I did some years ago. He discovered that the Loeb Classical Library, which is a collection of the classic texts of the Greek and Roman tradition, the books were the same size and shape as the old Union prayer books. And so he would go with his wife to synagogue because she went to pray, and he went with a volume of the Loeb Classical Library and read that instead, and nobody knew the difference. And it turns out people thought he was very devout and focused because he was so focused on what he was reading during the service. But he was there for the people, not there for the prayers. And the communal leadership were Reform rabbis and conservative rabbis, even some Reconstructionist rabbis. They presented an image of the Jews as a pious people and of Jewish identity as primarily a religious identity when the lay people were much less religious. Again, it was the emperor's new clothes. Who's willing to say the truth? And who's willing to admit that maybe there isn't even an emperor at all? We face the innovator's dilemma. This is described in modern organizational structure literature as the challenge of, do you try to find a new market and lose the old one? You see, you might be the best darn horse carriage maker in town, but if the car shows up, eventually you're going to lose. It's a marketplace of ideas out there too, you see. It's not just about money. They say change or die in the marketplace. If you don't change, you're going to die. Well, the fear is, what if you change and then you die because you lost the people you already have? If what we have in the Jewish community is Reform and Conservative and Orthodox Judaism and it's all religious, well, if we're willing to admit that some people aren't that religious, what's going to happen next? Maybe they won't come around at all. Or maybe they'll find their own community of like-minded people. Another slogan we like to use, like-minded people who don't think alike. It all depends on what you think religion is. Is religion a supernatural gift from above, something that's unable or very hard to change because it has the imprimatur of faith and tradition and generations and God? Well, that's hard to change. That's hard to steer that ship. But if religion is a phenomenon created by people to meet human needs, to answer big questions, to provide comfort and community, to have a feeling of transcending your individual experience through beautiful music and a sense of connection to heritage and feeling part of the natural world, if you find this identity to mark life cycle moments and important moments in the calendar, the transitions of seasons at the Jewish New Year, well, then changing your tradition is not only possible, it's necessary to meet those human needs in new ways, in new circumstances. In addition to the Torah portion of the week that many congregations study and recite, there's also a relatively newer tradition called the Daphumi, the daily page of the Talmud. And people will sometimes take one page of Talmud every day based on the standard Vilna edition of the Talmud. And if you do that, you will finish the Talmud in 7.5 years, doing one page a day. I started doing the Daphumi several years ago, shortly after my first child was born. That was mistake number one, because I quickly ran out of time to keep up with a daily practice of studying and writing something about it. These days I get a mass email that gives you the summary of the Daphumi from a particular institution. But I've been struck in the last couple of weeks. They're studying the section called Kiddushin, which is a section about marriages, engagements, loving partnerships in theory. But the last several pages of that daily study have been about slavery. What does that have to do with marriages? Well, you acquire a wife, you acquire a slave. You divorce a wife, you emancipate a slave. Now, if I were a woman studying this, or if I had sympathy for women while studying this, I would be really upset that all of this page after page about slavery, okay, now we'll get back to our core focus, which is women, or acquiring a woman. In fact, one of the reasons you traditionally don't get married on Shabbat is because you're not allowed to acquire property on Shabbat. Now, in theory, that applies to the woman as well, because she's acquiring the ketubah, which is a promissory note for what property she gets in case of a divorce. How romantic. You see, our approach is, we don't mind getting married on Shabbat because we don't see the loving partnership as acquiring anything. We see it as celebrating a loving sharing of each other and of that love with the world. And if anybody asks me, do you mind doing a wedding on Shabbat? Do we have to wait until sundown because in August that's really, really late? I say to them, don't worry. I do weddings all day on Saturday because coming to this wedding is probably the most Jewish thing the audience has done on a Shabbat in a long time. It's not like we're dragging them out of synagogue to come to this service or forcing them to drive when they never drive. Now, in some families, they are Orthodox, traditional, observant, and you do want to factor in that concern. In fact, my family, I got married on a Sunday because my father's family is Orthodox. I wanted them to be able to come if they chose to come, came. if they had chosen to come. And so that was a possibility. That was a choice that we made. But if other couples choose to get married on Saturday, I'm happy to create a Jewish experience on a Saturday for everyone who's there to celebrate that wedding. And I'm not struck and stuck by the limits of the traditional law and practice. This is, as I said, a religion of the people, by the people, and for the people. We respond to human needs. We meet people where they are, and we include them in the creative process. Our weddings are done for people, not to people. We focus on what we can do to meet their needs. We try to find the right balance of Hebrew text and English text, which may not be my choice. If I were running a service for just me, I might do things differently. But I do it for us. We create these services for us. Some people love responsive readings. Some people hate responsive readings. Some people love moments of silence, and they could go on for 5, 10 minutes. Other people would fall asleep if we had a 10-minute moment of silence, or get antsy. They want to hear something or say something or do something. Even 30 seconds feels long to them. The truth is, there is no perfect thermostat setting. It will always be too hot for someone and too cold for someone else. And the same is true for a service. It will be too long or too short. There is no Goldilocks service that is just right. But what we try to do in our congregation is to appeal to diverse needs and take diverse approaches. Some music that's sing-along, some music that's performative by the choir or by our soloists, moments of silence, opportunities for personal reflection, poetry, prose. We try to include all of it to meet all of those needs of different people. When you make your religion, when you make your Jewish community about people, you make it meaningful. People have often told me they love coming to my funerals. Well, it's better to attend than to be the guest of honor, but what they find more meaningful about these experiences is because the focus of the observance is the person. It's not psalm after psalm and Hebrew text after Hebrew text just filling their name in a blank. It's the story of their life, how they impacted people, what they were loved for, and how they loved the people who are still alive. You see, when you make it about people, that makes it meaningful, because that's the point of why we celebrate that life, why we celebrate a loving partnership. We make it about them, and most of the time, nobody even notices that I've shifted the Hadash to focus about peace instead of about God, or that I've taken the wedding and made it about this life and this world and these two people who are in love with each other and are building a life together. That's all it takes for it to be meaningful. There's an old story about the atheist getting dressed to go to synagogue. He puts on his talis, puts on his prayer shawl, he puts on his tefillin as he's preparing for his morning prayers to perform them before he goes to synagogue. And his son says to him, "Dad, what are you doing? You and I both know that you don't believe any of this stuff." And the father says to his son, "Well, son, you know, I have a friend named Schwartz. You know Schwartz. Schwartz goes to synagogue to talk to God. I go to talk to Schwartz." It's the human connection. It's the community. It's talking to each other. Maybe spend a little bit of time thinking about being Jewish, about how to be a good person, how to understand the world, and how to understand ourselves. Well, that's a religion of the people, for the people in the 21st century. And so with that, since I know it's about the food and the fellowship, I will wrap up, and we have our closing song at the end of your service booklet. It's a song that wishes each other peace, love, and joy. Again, I want to thank our owning hosts, Andrea and Lynn, thank our choir and our music director, Ellen Apley, for their wonderful work tonight, and we will show them our joy by singing out to them and to each other, peace, love, and joy to be with each and every one of you.